You're listening to Our Space with Matt Batiste.
Scrolling through your Instagram feed, you're going to come across a lot of different artists of all kind, but there's one that came across my feed a couple of years ago, actually, that really stood out to me because I hadn't seen anything like it before. Jonathan Mazaltov, you create a whole new universe in your art, and it's all based on emo songs. So thank you so much for joining the Our Space podcast this week.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me.
Where did you get the idea for your art?
I mean, that's a pretty broad question, but in general, I try to base everything off of photos. So I have an archive of, over a decade of photos at this point. So during the pandemic, basically the only thing I had access to was archives of photos. So that's how the more collage-oriented stuff came to be.
So you kind of had all of these photos, you kind of worked around them and created art with these photos and then sort of added the music afterwards.
Totally. It was kind of more, it was more of like, I would just be listening to music whenever I was making stuff. And then that led to creating a certain atmosphere. And then now, fast forward, it's kind of become more of a retroactive thing where I can have somebody suggest something and then work based off that.
Oh, okay. That's actually really cool. I kind of thought that it was the other way around because your art and the world that you sort of create within your photos and your editing, it just goes so well with the songs that you choose.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it really depends. Sometimes I'll have a piece that just already is exactly what I want it to be for a certain song, or sometimes it will take a lot of listening to a certain track and then pairing a visual to that.
When did that shift sort of happen where you went from like, okay, looking through old photo archives and find a song to pair with it to, oh, hey, I have this song and we can piece together a cool piece of artwork for it?
Yeah, a lot of that shift, I guess more so happened as I tried to scale it kind of to be able to create more pieces, because then it became a matter of I had drafts dating back to, 2010s, and then I had stuff that I had made more recently. And a lot of that was just seeing what paired well with certain lyrics or what paired well with a certain atmosphere that album has, or even pulling ideas from the album art itself.
And now you have a bunch of people that are coming to you for customs. Do you ever find that gets exciting, sort of like trying to think of how you're going to work in what they want into it? Is that like is it a challenge for you?
At this point, I wouldn't so much say it's a challenge as it is. It's definitely one of the projects I enjoy making the most, just because everybody who reaches out to me, like first and foremost, if they're a fan of what I already make, the pairing just makes sense, and they're very accommodating to my process and the time that I take. And a lot of times I ask for inspiration from pieces that I've done in the past. So it kind of creates that sweet spot of they're familiar with my work and want me to create what I'm familiar with and enjoy making.
Have you ever been asked to do a custom from maybe a band or a song that you've never heard before?
I have. And there was a point in time when I was first freelancing more that I would take on projects, just kind of wide range. But now I find that the best intersection of client relationship with myself is if I also enjoy and personally connect with the song. So I'm very forthright with if somebody reaches out to me for a song that I'm not familiar with or don't necessarily connect with that artist as much, I'll let them know.
I feel like it would also be a cool opportunity if they like your other stuff and they like, your art, to sort of like discover a new artist that way. Have you ever discovered someone like that?
Maybe not necessarily discovered, but definitely made pieces that kind of stepped out of the aesthetic that I would typically gravitate towards because it was an artist that I might not listen to as much.
Do you have a favorite piece that you've made?
I have. So it's probably not too dissimilar to a band talking about their favorite songs, but I have my favorite pieces that people have seemed to enjoy the most. And then I have kind of more deep down pieces that visually I think are the most interesting or really like took a lot of time. And maybe don't have as much traction to them because they are a bit more like intricate or have a lot of visual elements going on. One that stands out is it was actually a piece inspired by a song. It was by A World is a Beautiful Place song. And it was the opener on their album Harmlessness. And it's a very kind of surreal, just open field that has a bunch of flower people kind of flocking to the center point. I really love that piece a lot. Did that a couple months ago.
Is there a piece that stands out the most popular when people come to you for inspiration that other people tend to love? Which piece is that?
Yeah, a lot of times it would be anything that has like waterfalls or like very kind of intense nature driven elements. Like there's one, I think I shared it again recently, but it was like a turnover piece that's like a cascading waterfall in this kind of foggy street scene. That was one of the first. It was not only one of the first designs that I think I posted that really got traction, but it was also the first design I ever animated as well. So that was kind of like a intersection of both animating a piece that already was very meaningful to me, but also people gravitating to the visuals of it.
Yeah, what sort of gave you that idea to take these pieces and animate them? Because I really like the effects and the aesthetics of them in video form.
Thank you. Yeah, it was so much of the things that I've created over the past several years was as a result of some sort of limitation, whether it was having to stay inside and revisit old photo archives, or with the video, it was because of Instagram and TikTok shifting to video-centered content. I wanted to find a way to piece in the visuals that I already was making in photo form, but have it feel organic if I were to put it into like an intercut video. I didn't want it to just be a still photo. So that was kind of how that came to be.
You started in 2020, correct?
Yeah, that was when I started sharing more video, or maybe even 21. For a long time I put off getting on TikTok. I didn't even have an account, or making video centered stuff, because it's daunting, especially because I've been shooting photos for over a decade at this point. It was like I was so accustomed to sharing photos in the format that is a scroller, or just like a more classic Instagram format, that when video became so popular, my number one goal was like, how do I make something that still feels authentic without it kind of compromising what I enjoy making, which is art pieces or taking photos.
Did you find that to be really daunting, sort of switching over into video? Like, was there a part of you that was like, I really don't want to do this, but I feel like I have to?
Undoubtedly put it off as long as I possibly could. And then now I'm thankful to have formats that I really enjoy making. But it took a lot of, it was a lot of iteration and a lot of, honestly, just watching other people's videos and seeing what things I personally connected with that felt still authentic to what they were creating. Because there can be a lot of inauthenticity, but there's people who create, I think, great content as well. It doesn't have to be a grab at something sensationalized.
Are you doing this full time now?
Yeah, I started doing art stuff full time in 2021, because I had barista full time for a while beforehand, and then during the pandemic was not actively working, so collage art became more of my day-to-day. And then I went back to baristaing for a bit, and then just became busy with projects. More so at the time was doing album arts and promo work for bands, and then now has transitioned to more print-based work.
How do you find the, time management between keeping up with the socials and also doing all of the artwork? Because your artwork stuff, I'm sure, has a lot of work that goes into it. Sure. And then, the social media kind of goes hand in hand with the actual making it a business and getting your art out there to sell it, right? Do you find it's hard to juggle between creating both your art and social media, which is an art in and of itself?
Sure. Yeah, that's definitely that's an age-old question. I think for me, number one goal, even when I did start making more video content, was how do I make stuff that is like content, but also the stuff that I enjoy making, and not having it be two separate things. So most of the time what I'm sharing, the keeping up with the social media part is definitely like very time consuming, and it's a job in it of itself, as I'm sure you can also attest to. It takes a lot of time to not only just come up with what you're going to share, but also like constructing a narrative around it and doing whatever research, if it's figuring out bands to share, etc. It like takes a lot of time. So my number one thing was like, how do I make the art that I'm already making the majority of what the content ends up being? So like in the case of doing a vinyl format video, it's like the hard part is making the piece and then kind of creating this animated version. And then the slightly easier, more fun part is like creating the kind of narrative around playing a record.
Yeah, because I also feel like your videos are an art form in and of themselves. Like you kind of bring us into the world of your art through that video. And then it's like, oh, hey, we also have this still print that you can actually buy and put up on your walls. It's also really cool. Like it's the same art, but also different at the same time, if that makes sense.
No, thank you. I mean, that's definitely by design, and it is, I'm just thankful that it's a format that I enjoy doing and something that people seem to connect with, because also for a long time, it was a lot of creating different formats and testing different ideas and seeing what worked. And even some of the things that seem to work now for a long time didn't. So it's really like a lot of small iterations to get to a point to where it's like, okay, this format feels good. I'm proud of the art that I'm making. And then the third part of people connecting with it.
Yeah, and I guess experimenting to find out what works for you, that seems to be the hardest part for a lot of creators. Do you have a favorite band when you're going through with your artwork to sort of go back to with their lyrics? Like, is there one band that you've sort of done more than others?
Sure. Yeah, it feels a bit cliche, but I do get a lot of requests for the Wonder Years, just because, I mean, their lyrics are very both visual, and also I think they do a good job of structuring lyrics in a way that break up well. Because sometimes what I'll find is there'll be a lyric that I might really enjoy, or somebody might request for a piece, but I think that the sweet spot is something that visually sits well in a piece without it feeling like you're reading a novel that's on a photo, because that can kind of like detract from the overall feeling of the scene.
Yeah, to throw up like a whole chorus
right
in words, it gets too wordy.
I mean, I love a good chorus, but I really try to make whatever the phrase or the line be kind of like a subject in the photo. I treat it as though it would be another person in the frame. So sometimes the more wordy kind of long phrases can clutter the scene a bit. So it's like the Wonder Years has that sweet spot of like very punchy and also kind of short phrases that create like one-liners in a sense. Definitely Title Fight is another one, because they just don't, a lot of their songs, especially like Shed Era, are not super wordy, but everything that is said on the songs feels very purposeful. So that's kind of like another sweet spot.
There's so many artists or songs where I've been like, oh, this would be a cool piece of art, but then it ends up being the whole chorus, because you're like, oh, well, like, how do you figure out what part of that chorus or that line or that part of that impactful part of the song, what part do you want to actually remove? Right.
Sure. You also run into another thing that I've run into is trying to, not only is it fitting it into the scene, like you mentioned, but also having it actually correlate to the scene. Because sometimes you'll have a line that feels like it could work well, but it doesn't, it kind of feels like out of place visually in the scene, because the line either is referencing something that's not at all present in the like given scene, or it just like doesn't sit right at the end. So it's like a lot of parsing through songs and figuring out what line works well or what kind of spaces well into the scene.
Do you ever get any customs where you're like, ooh, I actually like this so much that I want to sort of put it out there to everyone?
I've done. So it's like with customs, it's such a catch-22 for that reason, is I don't really know until I'm like pretty deep into working on it, which I'm also stoked that the people who do commission me for customs are so excited about the pieces that they get, because that's what's important. Like, a lot of building up a foundation of being able to freelance and being able to do more print releases was people getting custom pieces when it was hard to even get people to care about the art that I was making outside of that. So it's kind of like, I always like to treat those with extra care, just because, I mean, that's like kind of the foundation of me being able to do everything else that I make.
Yeah, because I've always wondered, like, what if there's a piece that, other people are like, hey, I love that custom. I want one too.
Sure. It happens literally all the time. Probably more than you would expect. But I think, fortunately, a lot of the people who do reach out like that end up being either clients or looking out for other print releases that I make. And I try to hit a sweet spot of pieces that people request as wide releases, but then also keeping some as commissions.
Because, like, if you did a commission and say someone else wanted that same song or that same line, would you just do a different piece of artwork with that line for them? Or is it just sort of like, I've done this song, it was a 1-for-1 and that's it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I really try to parse through songs, because, I mean, even in a 3-minute song, there's like so much meaning that can be derived from whether it's the chorus, or even sometimes, like, especially in emo, the bridge is like kind of the climax of the song too. So there's been times where somebody will request the same song, and then I love kind of revisiting it and finding other lyrics that could work in a scene. But also, I try to, when I'm having a back and forth with somebody to decide on a song or decide on an artist that they especially connect with, I generally try to look for albums that they connect with, because I think an album is a more kind of full picture that I can pull from versus specifically one line in one song. I think that if there's certain albums that people especially resonate with, it makes it easier on my part to kind of pull visuals and pull certain quotes from various tracks, or see what works best with what I'm working on visually.
Yeah, it gives you sort of a broader spectrum.
Totally.
With that. So you had a really big 2023, like a really big 2023. Yeah. Hot Mulligan and Free Throw both had you working on some artwork for their releases. How did that come to be?
I think it was maybe closer to fall of 2022, or maybe even early 22, now that I'm thinking about it. But somewhere within 2022, I had worked on the single art for Drink, Milk, and Run. And that was just, I think I had made some sort of post or had made a design based on another band. And then Chris from Hot Mulligan had reached out to me if I would make a Hot Mulligan based piece. And I think I had already made one at the time, or maybe he had seen it kind of tangentially. And then he reached out to me to do the single art for Drink, Milk, and Run, which is probably also one of my favorite pieces that I've done. That was a really fun kind of both visually art that I'm proud of, and also they were just stoked on the direction for it. And it's a great song. So it was kind of like a perfect meld of everything. And then in 23, we released a printed version of that art, because especially since it was a single, I mean, somewhat selfishly, I also wanted a printed version of it because I knew it wasn't going to get like a vinyl release. So it was kind of like a nice transition to be able to take it from being just single form to a printed version.
I remember seeing that. The second I saw the artwork, I was like, oh, okay, that's Jonathan. Like, I know that artwork.
Yeah, that was the craziest part, honestly, was people tagging me before it had even come out. Like, because whether it's in a different country, getting it early because the streaming is going live, or even just before it was getting an official announcement. It was really cool to get people tagging me.
And how did the Free Throw album artwork come to be?
So that was, I mean, I think it was maybe May of last year. It was genuinely out of the blue. Like, just got an Instagram message from their manager and was like, hey, they are finishing up an album. It was before lessons had even been fully finalized, and they had reached out if I was interested. And I think it might have been specifically Corey from Free Throw had mentioned really enjoying my art, and I'd made a Free Throw piece before, so I don't know if it was through them seeing that or otherwise. And yeah, they were really great to work with, just being very trusting of kind of the idea that I had for tying in the visuals to both the lyrics and also the themes that they were going for on the album. But a lot of it came together, I think, over the course of maybe less than a month. So it was really quick turnaround between them getting the final version of the record, me hearing the record, and then me making the art.
Do you have any other artists that you're sort of working with right now, or anything that is sort of on the go? You don't need to mention any names if there's anything that's sort of confidential, but
I've done a few smaller pieces. I think this year my goal has definitely been to focus more on doing wider print releases, because as fun as it is working with bands, I've kind of tried to scale back to working with bands that I especially enjoy and that are trusting of kind of my process, and that there's this kind of mutual appreciation for them valuing my art in the same way that I would value their art. So it's kind of, it can be very kind of daunting to go into a working relationship with a band where that's not as established, because it's like with any sort of client relationship, there's a lot of like give and take. So finding those bands that genuinely want me to create the art that I most enjoy creating is kind of that sweet spot. So for this year, I just have plans to do more of the print releases and just what I enjoy doing, kind of unencumbered.
I guess you've gotten to that point now, right, where you can sort of be picky with doing what you really love. And I mean, as an artist, I'm sure that's what that's where the best work comes from, right?
Right. I aim to make it as candid as possible. I never want any like smoke and mirrors, like, oh, you work with me and actually you're not going to get what I typically do. It's like, I want somebody to work with me because they so genuinely enjoy what I make. And I don't want to trick somebody into working with me or have it be some sort of like animosity because they have a vision and then what I create is just different from that.
Yeah, you want to stay on brand with what you do, and you want to work with people that are a fan of you just the same way you're a fan of them, right? Like, and I think that's a reasonable sort of expectation, especially with where you're at right now. Do you have a band that you really sort of do want to work with, and you're kind of hoping one day you wake up and you get that DM and you're like, hey, yeah, I want to work with you, definitely.
Man, there's so many. None specifically come to mind off the top of my head, but I think, like I said, that if there is a band that I enjoy, because I listen to a pretty wide spectrum of music, but especially like obviously some of the newer emo bands. If basically any emo band that I authentically enjoy reaches out to me and is down for me to make what I most enjoy creating, then I think that's like would be sick. There's like probably 20 bands that would fall under that category. I think one that I'm kind of like loosely associated with and have made pieces based on before is like Foxing. It's been a band that I've really enjoyed for a long time. If they had some sort of visual work that they wanted done, I would love to work with them on that. So,
work with them officially. Yeah, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I just think that they strike the sweet spot of a band that is constantly evolving and very authentic to who they are. And that's like really hard to find. And they are, a band that I've enjoyed for years at this point, like from having seen them almost a decade ago to even seeing them more recently and just how they've evolved too. So there's definitely something admirable about bands that have been doing it for so long that continue to create interesting and special releases.
Also, can I just say that your record collection is incredibly impressive?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a lot of people ask about getting into collecting. That's like probably one of the more common questions I get outside of art related questions. And it's kind of, I was thinking about how I got into collecting, and it's kind of a funny retrospective, which is there was a point during kind of 2014, 2015 where I was going to shows literally all the time, maybe on a daily basis, because there was a local venue that I would just go hang out at and then go see whatever show was happening. And a lot of times the bands, especially of that era, now it's more of a focus, but had kind of lackluster merch. So because I wanted to support the band, instead of picking up a shirt that I didn't necessarily care for or didn't think I would wear, I always would just gravitate to buying a record. Like if they had a record, I would just buy a record. So a lot of my collection at this point is stuff that I've collected from years of seeing bands play.
A lot of them are probably some smaller bands too, right? Because
Totally.
I know, like, I just upgraded my storage shelf there to one of the 4 cube shelves from IKEA, and I'm like,
Sure.
oh, look at all this space that I have now
That's
for
awesome.
new records.
Yeah, it's not, the more I've collected records and the more that I've gone into different genres of music and more bands, it's like definitely not a race. There's no like expectation of having a certain amount of records or that there's more value in having more records. It's like, if there's something that you enjoy, it's cool to pick it up, especially because, I mean, physical media is just, it's so cool. I love it, both from a design standpoint and the obviously more the ritual of putting on a record and listening to it. Recently, I've been collecting more tapes. So it's just fun to collect things, especially if it's something like music where it's like the shared appreciation of both enjoying listening to it, but also enjoying to look at it.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of physical media and physical music as well. I was collecting CDs before I had
Sure.
built up the record collection, and then they lost all of those in a flood. So that was heartbreaking. But I mean, records are cooler. Records are more fun.
Yeah, I mean, living in Texas, we get some pretty serious floods. So I like always am very conscious of having like some sort of like escape plan or something, because it's like, yeah, I mean, any sort of physical media is like daunting for that reason.
I'm just mad that there's so many CDs that I had that like you can't even find anymore on streaming services or like YouTube from like even my high school years of different bands that I was listening to back then. Like, you looking back, I'm like, these were just high school kids making records and I had their CDs, and like they were actually making really good music, but they didn't go anywhere because they were high school kids, right? And then they all went to college and got real jobs and the band broke up, and you know, that happens so many times. But so now there's so many of those CDs that are now lost. My record collection though is slowly starting to build, and I feel like the only way you can get a record collection like that is just sort of over time, slowly building and buying. And you know, with records, I feel like you also want the records that you actually enjoy and you actually like, right?
I mean, the other thing, and this is more of a personal approach, is that I try, unless it's a band that I really love where they have a lot of kind of diversity album to album, I generally try to keep it to like a 2 album per band.
Oh, really?
Kind of maximum. It really depends. There's some that I have broken that rule, but if there's a band that I say enjoy somewhat passively and I'm like, I want to own a record or 2 of theirs, I generally will pick up my 2 favorites, because those are the ones that I know if I want to listen to that band, I gravitate towards.
See, I'm more of a completionist where I'm just kind of like, okay.
I know it's hard not to be, trust me, but that's
like I like this band, I need all of them, except you know, if there's the odd record where maybe there's a few skips on that album, then I'll be like, oh, well, that's where I'll kind of break my rule, where I'm like, oh, okay, I'm a completionist, I need them all, but that one record I'm not the biggest fan of, so maybe we'll save the $40 and not buy that one.
I definitely try to visualize it as, if I'm going to put on this band, like, what is the record that I'm most gravitating towards? So that's kind of like where I strike that balance of, if somebody's hanging out or if I'm just putting on a record to listen to, like, and I want to listen to this band, what am I listening to? Especially, it can be interesting with bands where they do have a very diverse sound album to album, because then I'm generally more encouraged to pick up all the records. Well,
like a Title Fight, you know, you might be in like a punkier mood and you want to go with their earlier stuff. You might be in a shoegazy mood, go with their newer stuff. And it's like, yeah, you know, how do you sort of pick just 2 albums?
Yeah, that's that sweet spot where it's like each album has so much of a specific characteristic and a specific mood that you might be in when listening to it, that it's like almost worth having the discography, because it spans so vast in terms of genre.
Favorite newer or up and coming artist right now?
I've definitely mentioned them before, and I'm sure you've talked about them before, but Arm's Length. I really love Arm's Length. And both, I think that they put on a really good show, which is kind of underrated in the sense of, with social media, it's like so many bands are more focused, it feels, on the like social media aspect, and it's like the bands that really lean into having a good live show, I think, are just so, it's just so cool to see, because that reminds me of going and seeing smaller bands play at a club show and just putting on the craziest show, and it is so much more encouraging to check them out after the fact, just because they put on such an incredible show.
Arms Length are one of those bands that I hear mentioned a lot. I feel like they're gonna have. I feel like they had a really big 2023, and I think they're gonna have a bigger 2024. I remember a year or two ago, my brothers came over and they were like, "Hey, we went to this concert last night, and this band opened up, and they're like from here. Like I'm from Toronto, and sure. Arms Length is from Ontario. They're a few hours away from Toronto, and so they do a lot of shows in the area. And my brothers came home from a concert, and they were like, "Hey, we both went out. We saw this band, and this band opened up, Arms Length, and they were so good. They came home with these like teddy bear Arms Length merch, and they're like, yeah, they have the best merch. There's only like 7 people in the pit for them, but they were so good. And then they're telling me about them. I'm checking them out, and they're one of those bands that just, from the moment of my brothers coming home being like, we saw this band, there were only 7 people in the mosh pit, but they were freaking amazing, to I saw them a month or 2 ago, sure. And they opened up for Real Friends and Knuckle Puck, and the crowd was going crazy for Arms Length. So they just really had that quick incline that really sort of blew them up, and I mean, very well deserved. I'm really curious to see what happens from them this year. Yeah,
the live show is, a lot of bands I think are starting to focus on it more now, but it's so cool, because that's the foundation of what at least I most enjoy about emo music, is going and seeing a band and seeing a performance that feels very heartfelt and genuine, and then going and listening to the music after the fact and being like, wow, this is a genuine expression.
Do you get goosebumps when you're seeing live music, or like seeing a new band? Do you ever get the goosebumps or that tingly feeling?
Yeah, I do, and I think that some of those are some of the most memorable shows. I don't want to take up too much of the podcast time, but one that I actually got to relay to Free Throw when I had seen them recently was, they played a show that must have been to maybe 50 people, or potentially even less, sometime in 2017 or maybe 16. And it was like around the time that Bury Your Mind had come out, but they were primarily playing Those Days Are Gone songs still. And it was just probably the most energetic 50-person crowd for a band that I've ever seen. And so regardless of amount of people in the room or whatever, it was just such a memorable experience and such a great show. And just like, the crowd was stoked. And it's, those are always like the kind of memories that stick out the most over time.
Free Throw are definitely one of those bands where 100% they're better live than they are on the record, and it's really hard for a lot of bands to be that way. But I remember going to see them as well and being like, they're one of those bands I got the goosebumps for too, and was like, whew, they are insane. Like, you need to go and see them every time they come, because they're just so good live, and you feel that. I always feel like the goosebumps in going to the shows, like that's how you know when you go to a show, especially if it's an opening band and you sort of get those goosebumps or that tingly feeling, that's how you know that a band is a good band and that they're going to go somewhere, especially if they're opening and they're not quite there yet.
Yeah, I can only imagine it to be the most daunting experience to open, when you know that most of the crowd is there for whoever the headliner is, and you have kind of nothing to lose. So seeing the bands actually go fully all out is always like very gratifying, and just it like really turns you into a fan.
And I love when crowds actually show up for the opening bands as well. Like, I remember going to see, this past summer, I went to go see Alexis on Fire, and Pup was one of the opening bands for them.
Oh, that's amazing.
And it was an incredible concert, but like the stadium the amphitheater. I guess it was an amphitheater show. It wasn't like a general admission show, but half the people weren't even there for Pup, and I'm like, come on, people, what's going on? You know, and they're a Toronto band too. It was like all Toronto bands on that show.
That's a bummer.
And I was really bummed out that there weren't that many people there for Pup, because Pup are one of my favorite bands right now.
Sure.
So like anytime they come around, I'm going to see them. So yeah, definitely go out and see the opening bands too.
Canada bands too. Shouts out to all these great Canada bands.
Yeah, Canada. I feel like Canada's always put out really good music, especially within like the pop punk and emo world. I just feel like they need to get a little bit more love or recognition for it. There's a lot of good bands coming out of Canada, especially right now. So yeah, shout out to all of the Canadian bands. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me here today, Jonathan. I really appreciate it. I love your art. I've been messaging you for a couple of years, letting you know I love your art. So that
means a lot.
It's been really cool having you on the podcast today. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Our Space with Matt Batiste. If you enjoyed yourself, please support the show by subscribing and leaving a review.